All right, we're back to these three, but notice the ones I've added now. And I find it really is working well. It amplifies my experience with the questions when I ask the question, what do you seek? And my answer that I may know you more clearly, and the knowing you more clearly is the subject of Paul's 4 life-changing prayers. I hope you all have that card, or those spiritual renewal cards. We need to remind ourselves, Bob, let's bring some more for them. But the 4 life-changing prayers, knowing them personally, intimately, relationally, not just theoretically. So what do you seek? The knowledge of God. As A.W. Tozer put it, what comes into a man's mind when he thinks of God is the most important thing about him. So what comes in your... So secondly, who do you say I am? May I love you more dearly? Because the better you know him and the more what he did for you, the more you will do that. And then the third question, of course, is, do you love me more than these, which is to follow him more nearly, because it's to choose him over competing goods, you see, and including your own fleshly desires and aspirations. So I find that the 3, try it out this way, okay, and add those to it. We're going to be adding a card to the spiritual renewal cards. This will be on that, okay? But that's not our topic. We are looking at the Think on These Things series, and there's 12 booklets, and there's therefore 12 talks. And we've done so far living with an eternal perspective, and we just did perspectives on prayer. Now we're going to be looking at a third booklet, Discerning the Will of God. And so to look at that, I have lots of things, and there's no way I'm going to be able to get all this content in, but that's not my intention, but just to give you an idea of some principles. So I'll just share some thoughts with you together and see where it goes, and then we'll come up with a little process together. But knowing the will of, how do I discern God's will for my life? Isn't that a pretty common question? It should be, because it's pretty profound and needful. The idea is, I see that our walk with Christ and knowing his will is not a matter of techniques and rules. It's not some method that you do, but rather it's a matter of a relationship, you see. It's our responses to God's loving impulses in our lives that makes all the difference in the world. And we must remember that God's grace is always previous to our response. That's a very important principle. So that you're responding, you're not the one who chose me, I chose you. My grace is always going to be the initiator. And you must therefore be the responder, though, because I don't want you merely to hear and not obey. Because if you do not put it into practice and application, then you heard, but you didn't hear. You saw, but you didn't see, because you didn't put it into you didn't combine faith with action, and they must go together. So the divine sovereignty, the human responsibility, that wonderful synergistic relationship that we have is so critical. He loves our response when we respond to him in obedience, and he wishes to bless us, but we must therefore choose his desire over ours. And that's the hardest part in the world, is for me to be convinced that God has a better idea about what my best will and interests look like than me. Really hard. I know it theoretically, but practically, let's be honest with it. We have our own plans, and we don't like it when our plans get disrupted. Remember what I talked about with your chronos. Remember chronos versus kairos. Your chronos is what you put in your planner. Your kairos is what God interrupts you with. Or is it an invitation? You see, and so yesterday I had a day that was like that. And I struggled with this whole business. I had my chronological desires, as you might call it. And I kept on getting interrupted by these kairotic moments. I'm making that term up. Kairos is the Greek word for opportunity time. You can't plan that, you can't book it. So I call them kairotic moments where you live kairotically. How do you do that? You have to listen with a voice open to the prompts of the Spirit of God in your life, and be ready to hear, and be ready to also to notice these interruptions are really invitations, though you do not like them. And that's the hard part for me. So there's a contrast that I have to say, that it becomes a continuous series of daily responses where I let loose of my idea what my best interests look like and finally embrace his. Remember, I had told you about two things you have to believe in order to obey God. One of them is that God's in control and you're not. You might remember that one. And it's amazing how people still sustain the illusion of control. But we don't control a single day. It's just astonishing. A single moment. Everything is in God's hands. And there's no accidents. It's providential. It's deeply mysterious to me. It terrifies me when I think about how God orchestrates all events together in your life and makes them work together and conspire toward a good that actually transcends the evils that we would construe them to be. Why did this happen to my daughter? Why did this happen to my friend? These sort of things. How can he turn them into good? So it's a very difficult thing. Number one, God's in control and I'm not. Number two, he has your best interests at heart and you don't know what they are. You think you do. So when you see a pathway in front of you and you see four options and one looks like really a lovely paved highway, and naturally we want to take the highway, and it turns out to actually have been just a cul-de-sac. It was a dead end. It dribbled. And this pathway that doesn't look so great may be the thing that opens the door. But many times you can't get to point C without going through point B. You have to go through one thing to go to another. He does things in ways we can't understand. So I have to believe that he's in control and I'm not, and that he has my best interests at heart, and I don't know what they look like. Let me show you this little chart here I just drew from, I created it last night because I had a statement here in the booklet. Our life becomes a continuous series of daily responses to the Lord's promptings in our lives. We're going to choose to walk by sight or by faith and so forth. And then, so I just turned it into this. And this is not a bad overview, because the left side, and I have red light is what it is, as opposed to a green, or the green symbolizes growth, you see. So the sight versus faith, law versus grace, flesh versus spirit, our will versus God's will, resistance or submission. You know what as I go through these, I'll just tell you what's just coming to my mind. Autonomy versus dependence, worldly wisdom versus divine wisdom, our terms versus God's promises, life on our terms. We want to have the illusion of control. The temporal versus eternal. Find your life as you suppose you did, but actually you're not going to find your life until you lose your life. And I just realized what I'm looking at this moment. You know how I'm going through the Bible, and I'm listening through. I'm now to the Holman Christian standard, Christian version here. What do they call it? The Holman. It's the Holman Christian Standard Bible, and I'm up to Samson's riddle in Judges 15. And you know what? As I go through the Bible, and now this is my fourth time through since last year when I started to do it with the audio, and I do encourage you to try it out. Any kind of a device, try it for a week. Can you do that instead of audiobooks? And just give it a try for 1 week, and you'll find it's amazing. But I just realized what I'm looking at there. Well, what I'm looking at there now is in fact the summary of the Old Testament. What I realized. My mind is flooded now. When I see this distance, this difference between that column and the right, I see what God's desire is that you would only have a heart to obey me, because then it would be well with you. I want you to be blessed. I want you to flourish, but you can't flourish on your terms. You don't have the wisdom, the capacity to flourish, because your terms are not my terms, and your wisdom is not mine. Mine transcends yours. And until you admit that, you're in trouble. So it's constantly the temporal versus the eternal. This is a summary of all the stories that you run into, isn't it? So I find that this is a very important thing for us to really review. And as I see that, I look at my own life journey and I realize how it's very, very different because of Christ in a way that I couldn't possibly see things. And that now I see in his life a quality of life I couldn't have known. So God's will is a way of life. It's not an emergency support system. It's God has created us and he's redeemed us. So he doubly owns us. And our need, therefore, is to love. We have an obligation to fulfill his will as his workmanship and as his children. And it's a benefit. As you obey him, it benefits others. And then it's on your own self-interest. But instead of being self-interest, you start with Christ's interest, and then you guess what you discover. You find satisfaction as a byproduct. You'll never remember this, find satisfaction, contentment, and joy as ends in themselves, but only as the byproducts of pursuing his desires above our own. So that's the risk involved. You have to realize that you must lose your life in order to find his life. If that makes sense to you, it doesn't make sense to me, yet it does. Somehow I know that unless a grain of wheat dies, then it just remains by itself, but then it rejuvenates. It's this process of birth, growth, decay, and death, but then the resurrection. And every day is an illustration of that. As you remember when I talk about how you go to your burial chamber tonight, and you'll put on your shroud, pull over your shroud over your head, and go and die. And then in the morning you'll wake up, arise, and you'll arise from the dead. Similarly here. So I'm seeing my life in this way. It's good. God's will for us is good, acceptable, and perfect, Romans 12. So I must believe that I'm not in control, that he is, and that he has my best interest at heart, though I do not understand what it looks like. So again, I see this as a process of intimacy rather than a program. The Bible is not a how to do it manual, but a who to know guidebook. You see, it's really not so much how to do it, how to live, but who to know. Because if you know him, that you may know him and have life eternal. To know the one who authored all things, who is the one who is infinite, who is eternal, who is beyond our imagination. And to have that intimacy with him is an astonishing concept, that he reveals his overwhelming power in the natural world. But he's also inside of us. So that which is seen that reveals his glory is also, he's in us. So he again, the one who inspired all things, the infinite word, is the one who became the incarnate word, who's now, where does he now? Remember the next eye? He's the indwelling word. This means that you are indwelled by eternity and infinity, and he's in you, and you are in him. And yet, at the same time, you have to choose to let God be God each day. Who gets to be on the throne? So whenever you recite the Lord's Prayer, which I hope you're doing on the process, remember it's about your kingdom, about your will. It's about your rule and authority, your name, not my reputation. And in doing so, you're dethroning the self and enthroning Christ. So that's the whole idea. It's a subtle voice, but you can amplify the sound of that voice. How? How do you increase your capacity to hear the subtle, quiet prompts of the Spirit of God? How do you do it? Obedience. You want to know him? Do what he calls you to do. And so obey his commands. It goes back to John 14. If you love me, you'll keep my commandments. And he who has my commandments and keeps them is the one who loves me. And he who loves me will be loved by my Father. Then what does he say? I will love him and I will disclose myself. This is why I use this phrase, obedience is the portal of divine disclosure. It's the doorway. You want to know him better? Do what he calls you to do. All three of these texts, and it's pretty impressive when Jesus, in his last words, because he knows this is his last talk with his disciples, in that moment, soon before he's going to be crucified. Better nota bene, note that one well, the upper room discourse. We've gone through it together. But when I hear him say the same thing 3 times in a row, it's a nota bene within the nota bene, if you see what I'm going with that. At any rate, I'm saying that we are called to obey him, and then and obedience will amplify that voice. You'll be able to hear it next. It's the same way in nature that I've discovered, in the same way that each spring is better than the one before. The reason for that is because I'm able to see more this spring than I saw last spring. And that was better than the one before that. And because as you continue to grow in your aptitude and attention, you begin to notice things in the natural world you didn't see before. And it's quite astonishing. So I think I may have told you about my discovery that I never read about, but when I saw these azaleas when we were at Callaway and going for a nature walk and showing people how to look at the natural world. So as I noticed a detail in the azalea I never saw before. And it was quite remarkable because they all have 5 petals, but one petal only has all of this color, only one. And the stamen actually points to it with the anthers and the filaments, and they all point to that one petal that has the color. What's going on? That doesn't need to do that. It's like, what does the bees need to have a guide here? Follow this one. I go, oh, that's the one here. No, that's gratuitous beauty. And it's just a design thing that God loves, and he loves design and beauty and variety and so forth. So I began to say, is that true? And then I went to another one, then another one, and it was always the same in each one. Now it's your mission, although it's a little late, to look at the azaleas, but I don't know, there may be few around. My point is this, I couldn't have seen that before because I wasn't able to see that before. The more you train yourself, and isn't it always training? All of life is training in righteousness and intention. So your intention to know him and through his world as well as his word will increase your attention. And your attention then will actually become something that's intentional in terms of your desire. And you'll find you can see more. So it is so in the word of God, you'll see things you didn't see before. So in my view, it's always a growth in righteousness. God doesn't overpower us. He won't coerce us. It's a subtle voice that we must respond to his subtle voice. But he will always do things in ways we can't know, but in ways that will not overwhelm your freedom. So there's your ability to respond. You would not be a very interesting person if you were merely such that stimulus led to response. If you were a Pavlovian creature, it wouldn't be very interesting to God any more than if you think about a kid when, I love you, mommy, every time you pull a cord. That gets uninteresting pretty quickly. So you don't want a relationship with an automaton. You want a relationship with a person, but you know what that means. All the dangers, the perturbations of love, then you're subject to. So relationships are the most important things, but it's also the most dangerous, powerful thing you see. But what great relationship to know God and then to know him first and foremost enhances your ability to love others. To know him, to love him is then to be able to be secure to love others. And so you allow him to define you. And instead, he wants your response and he welcomes that. He wants you to participate. You can't contribute, but he's invited you as a child to participate in his ways. It's a dependent walk then in which we invite him to participate in all of our activities, you see, and we participate in his activities in that way. So to me, that's a very important idea. The fabric of your life is woven out of threads of minor decisions and form the habit because the small decisions will affect larger decisions. You see, sow a thought, reap an action. Sow an action, reap a habit. Sow a habit, reap a character. Sow a character, reap a destiny. It's the small things that eventually lead to the larger things. So fidelity in the small things. He was faithful in the very little thing, will also be faithful in much. He was unrighteous in the very little thing, will also be unrighteous in much. You see the principle? It's very critical for us to see. So the small things matter. So that it does matter how you don't pad your expense report, even little things like that. See little details like that. Oh, what do we suppose God's stupid that he can't see these things? It's amazing what people do that they wouldn't do if someone were around them, but they do it. But even though God is around them all the time, it's amazing to me. So again, the key is to live coram Deo is a phrase before the heart of God. You see, And if you want to be pleasing to him, then you discover once again that if you want that, do what I call you to do. It's a revelation of trust. And trust is the key to a quality relationship. So do you trust your friend? Do you trust this one who's ordered all things? Or if things get upset and do not follow your ideas, do you believe then does those circumstances change your view of God's character? So your question is whether your circumstances define your view of God's character, or whether God's character defines your view of your circumstances. You see, because you must view your circumstances, which change, in light of his character, which does not. Now we have a rock, or an anchor for our soul, a rock that's sure and steadfast. And therefore we need a guide. We need something dependable. And God is as good as his word. And we need that dependence in that relationship. So this is a pretty critical thing. I think there's some prerequisites for guidance that I talk about in the booklet, and one of them is obviously conversion, because you can't really walk with him unless you know him and to have a relationship with him. And you remember what that means. It's a transfer of trust. It's not a matter of believing about Jesus, but a matter of trusting in him. And there's always that process in which we make sure that we have, in fact, invited him in, and it's as the one who we transfer our trust from ourselves and our works and transfer it to him and his work. And when we do that and say, thank you for that grace, and I'm asking you to come into my life, that is not just a head trip, but it is a relationship that is going to continue to grow. And the more you know him, the more you will be able to know him. So your capacity will grow. Commitment, I think, is this principle, is another principle for me, where you have the idea of believing that God's will is truly actually acceptable. It's good, acceptable, and perfect. And you base it on that ownership, that you want to know his will. So you want to know his will, and an attitude of availability in advance is what's required here. So I must be available in advance, and I must not allow circumstances to deter me or distract me or to disappoint me or to defeat me for a few D's. I can go on. I love my alliteration. The attitude of availability in advance. Our natural tendency is to believe that, as I said before, our plans are in our best interests and that anything else is a threat to our happiness. That's why often people give God a multiple choice. And so what they'll do is pick a card, any card. And they picked out 5 cards from the deck and say, pick a card, any card. And well, you know what he's going to do. I'm going to go back to the deck. What about one of those? You see. Because how do you know what your best interests look like? Now, theoretically, you can't know your best interests unless you knew the future. You'd have to know the future to determine whether our present actions are good. Think about what you would have been able to do if you'd known what you know now, and then you were transferred back into the 60s. You'd all be fabulously wealthy men, and it probably would have ruined you. That's another matter. God often protects us from our own selves, because when we're too successful, it goes to your head, and it's kind of a dangerous thing. It's the third base syndrome. It's a guy who just woke up on third base and thought he had just hit a triple. He was born on third base. You didn't hit a triple. Everything you have is gift and grace. So don't deceive yourself and be so arrogant. So we believe that we know our best plan, and that's why we offer God these multiple choice prayers. Again, the wonderful illustration I've given you before of C.S. Lewis, how he speaks about a dog whose leash gets hopelessly wrapped around a pole, and the master, as a dog is choking itself to move forward, what do you have to do? You have to take that poor creature and make him go precisely the opposite direction of where he wants to go to get him untangled, so then he can go forward. And now, from that perspective, you would seem, I want to go there, and you're pulling me there. Do you see how our wisdom is so limited? You can't know God's will any more than that dog can understand what you were trying to do. In fact, he probably won't get cause and effect. He'll probably do it again. But the point is that you are getting hopelessly wrapped, and you said, let go of that. And so principles for guidance include these. I'll just share a few of them. One of them is, what do the scriptures say? Because God's never going to leave you to do anything that's contrary to his will. So when anybody says, God told me to do something, and if it's something that's not consistent with the word of God, I promise you that was not the Spirit of God. He will never violate his word. So don't play that game where we try to get God to do what we want and then play a game of Bible roulette where we pick a verse that makes us want us to do what we want to do and finding his will that way. So the guy plays Bible roulette. Let me just pick this. Jesus went out and hung himself. Well, that's not a good verse that I want. So pick another one that says, go and do thou likewise. No, I don't want that one either. And then the third verse he hits is, what you do quickly. So that's Bible roulette. Instead, what you realize is that God will, as you better you know his word, the more you'll know his will. You see, because he will always reveal his true character in the word of God. And then your conscience, I think, has a role, and common sense as well. How will it affect others and so forth. Sometimes there are subtle things. But does this decision reflect good judgment? How does my state of affairs relate to this decision? There are always kinds of things of that sort. But God often works, as I've discovered, by opening and closing doors. And my job is not to run ahead or to lag behind. My tendency is to run ahead of the will of God. Some people pull behind. So when he opens up a door, I am responsible then to go through it. But if he closes a door, I'm not trying to push it or make that thing happen. I need to know this person in order to accomplish this. Then I'm going to try to manipulate things and do things for God rather than allowing him to do things through me. So it's always going to be, stop trying to do that. Allow me to take care of it. If I want you to have this or to meet that or to have the other, leave that to me. And so stop trying to open and if I open a door, go through it. Don't just be passive. But if I close the door, don't try to kick it open. So there's a fundamental wisdom there. But I also think when you have an important decision, counsel is critical. What do wise people say about it? So there's some obvious questions that relate to this. And my desires, of course, should be what is to be pleasing to him. And I think one of the things that God will provide, if I tell people, if you don't have peace, if you can defer the decision, do it until you have a sense of peace. It may seem right, but if you can put it off, do that, because I think that peace is a supplemental principle of guidance, not sufficient, but I think it certainly is a wise thing. I mean, there are a lot of crazy conceptions about God's will, that he wants you to make you miserable, and so forth. It's that he's come some kind of a cosmic Scrooge, but that's not at all the image of what God's like. But you see, the difference is hoping for versus hoping in. So I can hope for various things, but don't put your hope in anything other than the character and promises of God. And when things go against you, you must choose the way of gratitude and thanking him for things you don't even want, because he's going to work together in ways you cannot currently see. At the end of the booklet, I have a prayer, and it's by Blaise Pascal, and he puts it this way: with perfect consistency of mind, help me to receive all manner of events. For we know not what to ask, and we cannot ask for one event rather than another without presumption. This is a pretty radical prayer, by the way, as you can see. We cannot desire a specific action without presuming to be a judge and assuming responsibility for what in your wisdom you may hide from me, O Lord. I only know one thing, that it is good to follow you and wicked to offend you. Beyond this, I do not know what is good for me. This is a big word. Whether health or sickness, riches or poverty, or anything else in this world. This knowledge surpasses both the wisdom of men and of angels. It lies hidden in the secrets of your providence, which I adjure and dare not to pry open. And so that's a prayer in Pascal's Pensées. Now that's a pretty radical thing. And yet he does invite us to offer our prayers and petitions. Hold them with a loose grip, though, but let your joy be dependent on your strengthening yourself in him and obeying him even if it doesn't make sense to you. Because that's what trust is about. You'll never understand God, but you can learn to trust him. And that to me is the key theme in this whole thing. You'll not stop trying to understand him, stop challenging him, and stop rebelling against him. Instead, choose the way of trust and obedience. I'm going to leave this little chart that I showed you earlier up here for your discussion. And by sight versus faith, this summary of really the old and the new. And how do we move more and more to where the faith, the grace, the spirit, God's will, submission, dependence, divine wisdom, God's promises are the eternal and losing our life? How do we move into where that becomes more and more characteristic, and not just in the big decisions, but in the little things that constitute the fabric of your life? We were talking in our group about the fact that there are these 4 components. You may know about a thing, you may have an understanding or an experience, but it's the application that's what makes all the difference, isn't it? Because you must unite belief with behavior. The two must go together. It's a completion in which belief and behavior reciprocally enhance one another, you see, so that the more you obey, the more you're capable of obeying, because you now are choosing to walk by the Spirit. And as I said before in our experience, that I see this contrast between the sight and faith, the left side and the right side, as being not just an illustration of the Old Testament, but also it's in the New Testament. But in the New Testament, we have provisions they did not have. We have the indwelling Christ in us now. We have the spirit of adoption as sons by which we cry out, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. This they did not have. You see, the Spirit's filling was selective and temporary. Now we have the Spirit inside of us, and yet we can grieve the Spirit, and we can, through our disobedience then, actually kind of callous ourselves to receptivity because we're not able to hear it, because we're not applying it. And we're not applying it because of our own pride, our own pursuit of our agenda above God. So it always comes down to who's at the center of our lives, whether it's Christ or us. So this to me is this contrast between the red and the green then was really revealed in the Old Testament in every story I can think of. I just see it again and again. I'm just going back, story of Abimelech I was just listening to. In every case, it's a back and forth thing, my will or his. And every time obedience is honored and disobedience is dishonored, but yet they still continue to do the same stupid thing. It amazes me. And I've told you this many times before. You know you've never regretted an act of obedience, have you? Not in the long run. You resisted it. I'm sure we've all resisted it because it goes against what we think is best. But whenever you choose to take the trust and the risk, then obedience is actually enhanced and you discover God's purposes. But I've always lived to regret acts of disobedience. So if that's true, it should be a no-brainer right today. You should it'd be stupid to shoot yourself in the foot. Yet we're very likely to do just that. It's amazing. But God puts up with this, and I think one of the bases for this is because he sees us as we will be. And that is the way we can see ourselves as well. His intention is that we will be perfect and holy and righteous in him. He sees us in the heavenly places, and he wants us to live out that identity in this present darkness. We have that option. Let's see what questions that you had is over
Ken,
there. Yes.
Ken, right here. Ken?
Oh, there you are. Yeah.
Couple of,
Here,
first of all, the secular decision-making model versus the spiritual decision-making model are like night and day.
Yes.
And that's the first point I think that's really important. 2 things that came out of that I've seen in the book, and I believe this is a book I wish I'd had when I was 20 and is a great mentoring tool. Number 1 is the answer to a prayer may be yes, but not now, which is something you cite in there. And I think that's important. The other piece I just want to mention, the analogy where a farmer really wanted to preach the gospel. And one day he saw a PC in the sky with the clouds. And he said, that obviously means preach Christ. So he sold everything and he went to preach Christ, but it could have also meant plant corn. And the point behind that one is this. Sometimes we wrap our paradigms, back to your point about the cards that you mentioned earlier, we wrap our paradigms there so we take what we see as observations and fact, and we put them to our own world. And to pull yourself away from that is huge. And I thought that was a great analogy.
It is. We construe according to our desires. And so we just actually interpret. We're highly selective, by the way, in our memories. We have a way of remembering the things that serve us better as a rule, and remembering, and so other people have a different view of the same situation. This is why you have to hear both sides of the coin. But that's exactly right. We can deceive ourselves, and so easily done. And so the desire to just come before Him with an open heart and an open desire, may I be pleasing to you. I make it my ambition to be pleasing to Him, and that means that the pride must be replaced by, instead, a new identity in Christ, where you become Christocentric. He's the center, and He increases, we decrease. There's a question over here. Yeah. Yes.
Not a question and slightly off the subject, but
I like that. Not a question and slightly off the subject. Should we should we give this man a platform?
Well, I hope so, because we know that Pastor Jeff is preaching on spiritual warfare.
Oh, he is?
Right now. He is.
See.
And he's right in the middle of a series. And he's under attack, and our church staff is under attack. And they need our prayers.
Uh-huh.
And that's all I want to say.
I will say this, whenever I speak on the spiritual warfare, it's not a surprise. It's just because Satan, the enemy of your souls, does not want his tactics to be revealed and made obvious. It's there all the time. And so when you begin to do that, you start meddling. And it's actually, it's kind of a kind of backhanded compliment in a certain way. Whenever I teach on the book of Job, you know what's going to happen. And so it goes as well. So because you get attention to that, you kind of draw attention to yourself. When you begin to be a player, a champion, it makes a big difference. And because if you become a champion for the cause of Christ, basically the whole idea of the knight of faith, where you are a man who's called to be a spiritual champion, a person who overcomes and who does not walk in fear, but walks in a sense of a holiness and a hope and an understanding that we are far more with us than with them. That the world, if we come to see it, the enemy has actually been defeated. But to see it that way, spiritual warfare is going to be stirring up. It's like a hornet's nest. As soon as you reveal their strategies and their tactics, because the devil would rather appear as an angel of light to be more deceptive. He's not going to come around with a pitchfork and a tail and the red suit, but he's going to come in perceptions of peace and prosperity and other things that are more subtle and more desirous, you see, and then he lures us away subtly through the lust of the flesh, so that the flesh is the internal component that's always there. You can't improve it or remove it, and that's only going to happen when we stand before Jesus and He burns that away. But there's always that inside capacity, which is the first central part of the warfare, and then the other two are external, as you know. The flesh is there, but it's not the deepest you. It's the remnant of your mortality in Adam. It's the old habits and attitudes, and we're in a spiritual forming world. But there's also the devil and his angels in the world, and they amplify it and provide opportunities. And the world there's never been a time in which there's more opportunity that the world has provided than now, because it's been ramped up by technology in ways that are utterly unprecedented. And so you could be in despair if you thought of that. But my hope is always in the fact that the one who made all things will bring everything to its consummation. We're in a comedy, not a tragedy. You know, it's when it ends. If it ends well, if If the key people are still there, you're in a comedy. But we are not in a tragedy. We are in a divine comedy. And ultimately, we are praying that his kingdom would come and his will would be done on earth as it is in heaven. Right now, even in a fallen world, everything obeys the intentions of God except us. But one day it will be so. When he comes, when the king comes, and he enters onto the stage, the play is over. But now the new story really begins. And that's the story that no one has read, in which every chapter gets better than the one before. It's a lovely image that Lewis provides at the end of the Chronicles of Narnia.